All right, what is up, guys? It's Halsey with the Helicopter Podcast, and I got good buddy Ian McCarthy on the show today. Ian and I met some years ago at a heli expo far, far away in Sin City, actually, of all places. So I'm happy to reconnect with Ian today. We've stayed in touch throughout the years. He's certainly progressed. Ian, welcome to the show. I think when you and I first met, you were still training, correct?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, Halsey. Appreciate it. Yeah, in the Heli Expo, I think at that point I had just started as an instructor, as a flight instructor out in
Okay, so
Vegas there.
you were working. Yeah, I knew it was like pretty early on, uh, and I was I think just a little one step ahead, I guess, just flying tours. And I remember just getting to connect with you and Heli Expo in Vegas is always a tall order. If I recall, we had a pretty good time. You were pretty subdued. I think it was mainly me, Brian, and our buddy Bodie that were really having a good time. So thanks
Yeah,
for putting up with us.
yeah, it was my first Heli Expo. I actually haven't been back since. I've been wanting to go. I regret not going to the Dallas one since it's so close to me in Central Texas here. But maybe the next one I'll try to pop out there because there's always cool stuff going on.
Well, yeah, no, I totally agree. Heli Expo is actually so technically in Vegas when I met you that year. I didn't go to Heli Expo. I was just living in Vegas at the time,
Hmm.
and so I didn't actually go to the show. And admittedly, I never went to Heli Expo until 2 years ago when it was in Dallas, and I was exhibiting for the first time with Helicopter. And so we've gone the last 2 years as exhibitors, and I have to say it's a super fun time. And I know that you, with your Critical Angle YouTube channel, have done things in the past, and I feel like Heli Expo would be like an awesome place, for you to go and shoot and check out. And I think you actually did for the Vegas one, correct?
Yeah, we made a short little video, did a couple interviews. I think the Erickson folks was one of them. That was pretty cool. Definitely would be. It's a different experience though when you're going as like an exhibitor or like media versus just going to just check out the cool stuff. Because you're in that kind
Yeah.
of work mode.
Yeah, I mean, for me this year, especially, we were doing a lot of content as well. So it was like 2 days before of content, and then the whole show. And then, of course, I'm a small little baby company. I'm not like having anyone like, all the other big companies, they just leave and then someone just cleans up their booth. I'm there after the show, taking everything down, trying to, not fall asleep because, it's long days, late nights, great networking. It's a good time. It's in Anaheim this year. Do you have any plans on maybe trying to check it out?
I'll look. I need to see the dates with my schedule. I know far in advance, but if it's during work, it's tricky to get away for it. But yeah, I mean, if you're working and you're doing the social networking thing there, it's people don't realize how much work goes into that stuff. It's a lot.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. It's a good time. I mean, it's like that one time a year. This year, like halfway through, I was dragging. And my wife, who works for us at Helicopter as well, big part of Heli Expo, she kind of does all the organization for our company. She looked at me. She said, "Hey, it's once a year. Like you need to get up, go out to dinner, and network." And I'm like, "Yes, ma'am. I'll do it." So, it's always fun. We're gonna drive down. We're up in Oregon now, so we're gonna drive down to Anaheim this year. I think on the way down, check out some cool sites, but also meet with some operators, and then stay with some family in LA afterwards. So, trying to kind of, I don't know, for whatever reason, that feels like it will be easier, but I think it's going to be kind of a nutso time again. But let's just get right into Critical Angle because I think one of the first things that before we even met, or maybe shortly thereafter, I started watching your videos. And I thought maybe even a couple of your videos like had lots and lots of views, and it
Mhm.
seemed like the channel was really progressing. What kind of spurred you to start doing creating content specific to helicopters. Where are you at with it now, and what are some of the plans for Critical Angle?
Well, part of what kind of got me interested in aviation, about I've only been flying about 6 or 7 years or so, but I was watching some of the big airplane YouTubers and like Steve Okinivo's. I'm sure everybody knows about him, and just kind of getting into it. I decided to go the helicopter route, but then when I was doing, I was like, oh man, I don't see a lot of content out there on the helicopter side. There's a ton of the airplane YouTubers. So I'm like, man, I can do this. I had some film and editing background. So luckily, Brian was my instructor, and before that, Eric, and he was cool with it. So I strapped some cameras in there and started, uploading videos for essentially nobody. Right? It was early on. It was, it's tough to build that audience. And all these gurus out there saying that they got the easy shortcut. There isn't one. They're going to tell you the same thing. Just be consistent and have decent content, and the views will come. But I can tell you one thing: as a student pilot, reviewing my flights afterwards was like almost invaluable just by itself, because I was able to go back and see things that, like, I mean, I'm trying to comprehend what's going on in the helicopter, and like your mind is so saturated, you're missing, I don't know, 60-70% of the things that are going on. So as a review tool alone, it was fantastic. I, as a professional pilot now, you have to be careful about what you upload. And it's not one of those things that we're out there doing bad things, but one simple mistake that we all make, we're humans, right? And you upload that online. Now it's being scrutinized by, a lot of people. So you have to
Yeah,
just be
no,
a little
you
cautious about that
you
stuff.
got to be careful, and with you, especially with air medical, there's a lot of
Hmm.
non-flying things that you need to consider, like the HIPAA Act and things like that. What was your most popular video? Mine was my personal favorite, and we'll post the video links in the bio. So if you're listening and you haven't seen any of Ian's videos, my favorite is one, I think you did it with Brian, and it was like kind of pretending that you were getting drive-through at
Yeah.
McDonald's or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we had planned that video. I think for like a year we were talking about it, something like that. For a while, I think the most popular video was Brian and I again going to Salt Lick Barbecue, which was a very popular destination. It's a local barbecue joint that's pretty famous, and they've got helipads in the vineyard back there. And then there's another one I did on hog hunting. That was with Steve at the old company I used to work for, and a lot of people seem to like that. And I kind of really wanted to show the fact that it's like, hey, these animals are destroying crops and people's livelihoods, and we're out there, trying to help those folks out. But from looking back to your other question on, like, kind of what's the status of the channel, where's it going? Where the channel kind of fell off. I had been a professional flight instructor for about 10 to 12 months or so. And I was doing that Brazil trip, and, it's a bummer because that I filmed that whole thing. It was like a two week long trip, like 5,000 something miles. And the first, quarter of it, like from Canada to Florida, was the SD card got corrupted. And
Oh
so,
no.
yeah, I know. So I spent weeks trying to recover it. I put it into professionals and everything, couldn't get it back. And, I lost steam and everything got delayed and delayed. And eventually it's just like, how it goes. But man, before that, I was like, it was every Sunday at like 9 or 10, it was consistent. I was like, man, I got to get a video out once a week. So it's a lot easier when you're a student and you fly, maybe 150 hours in a year as opposed to 1,000 hours in a year as an instructor. And going forward, it's tough to maintain. I really do want to get back into it. You know, the aeromedical side, which I'm doing now, it's a tricky thing. I think we've talked about that in the past about when you're in the 135 world and you have, GOMs and op specs and all these things, and a large company. I mean, Air Methods, the company I work for, we've got something like 5 or 6 thousand employees and I think 1,500 pilots, and it's a big machine, right? And I'm just a little cog in it, so I don't want to make the machine upset at me. So it might be a thing that I talk with the marketing department and see if maybe we can work out some kind of deal with that. but I just have to tread very carefully, if I'm going to create that kind of content going forward.
Yeah, I think, in that situation, it's definitely better to ask for permission than beg for
Yes.
forgiveness. Maybe sometimes I would, suggest the opposite. But, I think with a big organization, but I also think specifically Air Medical, who I believe is quite desperate across the board for recruitment, bringing on new pilots, especially. I feel like it would be a valuable tool. I remember when I was looking at Air Medical, I would go on YouTube and search, like, at that time, Air Evac is who I got hired by, like, day in the life of Air Evac. And there's like one video,
Yeah.
that was probably 13, 14 years old. And, so I feel like, your video, your editing skills are really good. You obviously, with the background that you have now, it looks great, by the way, there in your home studio.
Hey, thanks.
So kudos to you on that. Um, and actually, you kind of helped me and advised me on some of the stuff that I could do with my studio that I took to heart. So I appreciate that. So yeah, I think with Air Methods, or any company like that would be valuable recruiting and training tool. So hopefully you can do that. I totally get it. Putting out content is a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of work. And it's usually volunteer work in the sense that, there's not a huge monetary gain until you're getting a lot of, listens in my case, or viewers or whatnot. So I definitely get it. I'm working on some fun stuff that you and I have talked about. So I think there could be some fun collaboration with the Helicopter Podcast and Critical Angle. So that would be pretty cool. And again, to my listeners, I'm going to go ahead and put the link to Ian's channel here in the bio. So go over there, check it out, comment on his videos, tell him that you want more, give him that motivation, right?
Yeah, you mentioned that we need pilots desperately in air medical, and everybody hears about the pilot shortages, and helicopter side is affected because a lot of folks are actually jumping ship to go to the airlines on the fixed wing side. And the problem is though is that these jobs that are hard to fill have crazy experience requirements. So it takes years, of sweating in the trenches, right, to get the experience to get into that. But once you reach those, milestones, the kind of the world's your oyster. If you're willing to move, that's a big thing too. It's hard to find these jobs close to home. With Air Methods, I'm kind of lucky. I actually work. It's about a 7-hour drive away from where I live now, but with that float position, they just kind of move me where they need me, and I've actually been at the same base for the last year, so it's not like you're going to a new place every time. Um, but yeah, that would kind of like you were saying, hey, there's one video made 12 years ago. That's kind of the reason, like I said, that I started this whole thing in the first place, is because there is a desire for that stuff by people. I feel like they want to know, and just the raw stuff. Like they just want to know, no fancy quick cuts and no cool music. They just want to hear the comms and the real conversations. And again, like I said, with and now you got medical side, you got HIPAA concerns, so you got to be careful with patient privacy and all that stuff as well. But there's ways around that, and it definitely might be something that I'll try to work out in the future for sure.
Yeah, I think it would be awesome. So you've been in the industry now for 6 years. It's an interesting thing that you bring up. I don't think we've talked a lot about it on the show. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you have any friends or other experiences of people taking advantage of some of the rotor wing to fixed wing transition that the regionals are offering?
Well, our mutual friend Brian, I know he's doing that. My flight instructor. It's funny. I run into people all the time too. I was actually just in an FBO, and I had followed another, I think a PHI air evac into there, and we were just kind of both waiting on the same hospital because our crews are both there. And I walked in and they're like, "Hey, are you you a Black Hawk pilot too?" And I was like, "No." And apparently, all of them were Black Hawk pilots that happened to waltz in here, and two of the guys were renting a bug smasher to try to get their airplane time up so that they could go to the airlines, because these guys get out of the military now. They've after 10 plus years, they've got 700 flight hours, which as in the business, man, you're not going to get a helicopter job that's worth anything, right? You need a bare minimum of 1,000 hours. So these guys are just trying to get to the airlines, I guess, chasing the money. That's where the money is. But it's a tough schedule for a lot of years.
Yeah, my 2 cents on it is first and foremost, disclaimer, I was lured to the dark side. Uh Myself actually, I was working air evac. I've talked about it on the show many times, so I'm not going to beat the dead horse that I didn't like air medical, specifically the nights, blah 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 blah. I've said it before. I do want to talk to you about that though, because I always like to get others' opinions, but I ended up thinking, hey man, I'm not in love with what I'm doing. I want to fly. Is there an alternate path for me? And it seemed like at that time going to the regionals. And I ended up talking and actually interviewing with a company called Envoy. Got the job. Got our conditional offer, I guess it was called. And essentially, they were going to pay for all of my flight training. And I was all gung ho, excited to do it. And I ended up actually starting to sell roofs in South Texas. As you're familiar, it hails a lot in the springtime in South Texas. And when there's hail, there is insurance roofing claims. And so I started being a door to door salesman, selling roofs, specifically after a hail event. And it was very lucrative. I got to stay close to home. I was actually still flying air evac at the time. And so my motivation for going to the airlines at that point kind of dwindled. And I had a lot of friends that had gone and then ended up coming back. Uh, so I think my opinion is like the grass is not always greener. I think the regional specifically is very hard. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've always said airlines are not going to be fun for like 4 or 5 years. And then if you can get to a major, build your seniority, then I think long term, 20, 30 years from now, yeah, you're making a crap ton of money. Your schedule is limited. Your flying, is limited, but you're getting paid a lot of money. But it just takes a long time. So I'm just not sure the grass is always greener. And, I definitely have had a lot of people go and then come back to helicopters.
You know, yeah, and on the pace side, I mean, I remember not too long ago when people were talking about going to the regionals and starting at like $30,000 a year, and now, I mean, I'm hearing about 120 is where guys are starting at, depending on where they're at. So it's at least they're not having to live on peanuts for years, but the scheduling is not going to be great. If you're doing long hauls across the ocean, I mean, talk about messing with your circadian rhythm and kind of, night shift. And we can get into night shift on EMS here in just a bit, but similar kind of deal. But you can max out a lot faster in the helicopter world, I feel like, but your max is going to be, I don't know, a third or a fourth of what your potential overall max could probably be in the airlines or that kind of world. But the funniest thing to me is, I got into helicopters because I'm like, oh man, airplanes are easy and boring and all that stuff, and helicopters are fun. And that can be true in some aspect, but I got my fixed wing add-on later down the line. I was already an ATP helicopter, but fixed wings have their own, like, I respected airplane pilots a lot more after that, because there's it's very technical stuff, right? Like, have this RPM and this altitude, this airspeed by this time. And like in the helicopters are just like, set it about there. And that's good. And there are a lot of helicopter, in-game, I'll call them, jobs that involve like incredible skill, and they're really wicked, like, firefighting, or, the chainsaws hanging down, cutting the trees for the power lines and stuff. But like aeromedical, where I'm at now, I mean, I don't know, probably the base I'm at is 85% or so transfers, where it's just like an airplane. I mean, it's an airplane that can take off vertically. So we take off from the same places, cruise level flight. I'm on autopilot, chilling for an hour, and come into land. And, it's like, yeah, we're not having to deal with the airport. And we flying in the airport, we've got a lot of leeway, like coming into Dallas Love, I just go straight to the ramp and don't have to taxi and all that stuff. But, the people that you need to kind of take that into account, that like, hey, when you get to these in-game jobs, a lot of them, like if you're doing charter or anything like that, it's the same stuff as airplanes, except slower. By the time you get to that, you're like, man, I wish I was going about 3 times as fast as I am now.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind cruising at 30,000 feet,
Yeah,
going
absolutely.
300-400 knots. Yeah, and it's funny that you say that because I do think biasedly that helicopters are a more challenging machine to fly. But last year I was doing a work event, and my client ended up kind of shuttling me around in his one of his many aircraft, which in this case was a small turboprop, a TBM. Super cool plane. If you're not familiar with the TBM, I think we were cruising like 28,000 feet,
Mm-hmm.
300 something knots. I mean, it was incredible. And the pilot, Colton, young guy, flying single pilot, and I'm sitting up front with him, and we're just after takeoff, and he's talking to this person, then talking to that person, and he's doing this and he's doing that, and I'm sitting there being like, oh my gosh, I've been a professional aviator for 15 years. I feel like I would be behind right now. Like this actually seems like a lot of work. So I do believe specifically like the single pilot world, whether you're flying a TBM or a small jet or a Pilatus or something like that, I definitely can see kind of the complexity of just the procedural side of it, compared to helicopters where we're a little more, say, relaxed when it comes to procedures or, talking to this center, then that center, and et cetera. So I definitely think that those guys earn their cheddar.
Absolutely. I mean, I fly the Bell 407 at work, and we're usually maxed out about 130 knots true. And so if you compare that to cruising around in like a 150 or 172, yeah, the workload's not going to be that high. But that TBM, yeah, it's a beautiful aircraft, and it is like a rocket ship. I mean, it's pretty much a jet as far as the speed wise. So you got to think how much farther in front of that aircraft your brain's got to be. And I mean, you're thinking 50 to 100 miles ahead in a lot of instances where it's like, yeah, we look occasionally at the helicopter on cross countries, but we're not getting there, that quick. Right.
Yeah,
So
you're like 5 minutes away from the hospital. You're like, okay, I should probably consider
yeah,
what I need
yeah,
to do here
coming
before I
down. Yeah,
land.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, because you can slow from 130 to, approach profile in, 5 seconds, really,
Yeah.
or probably a little longer. But, if you really had to stand on it, you could. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely think the airplane side, just procedural different. Yeah, you're having to plan ahead. Obviously, two pilot crew, commercial jets. I'm sure there becomes a very bit of redundancy kind of to that gig, but I feel like that's for every gig. I mean, for me personally, helicopters start to feel redundant, at times. So, I get both sides. I personally think that helicopters are still such an amazing machine. And like you said, it's one thing if you're out there, with the heli torch or the saws hanging.
Mhm.
Some of the stuff that like you and I fly, air medical, whatnot, does get a little mundane. But it's still kind of a very rewarding career and a fun job. And I like the air medical aspect because, yeah, in your case, 85% is transfer, but then, you still have good, 15% seen, which is always fun. I always enjoyed shutting down I-35. Have you shut down the 35 yet?
No, so where I'm at, I think it's I-20, and we don't get a whole lot of stuff on there. But yeah, I mean, that's, I was going to kind of go into that too, because I mean, you could do a normal transfer, or you could get a scene call where somebody needs your help right now. And the big thing we're in this business is nobody's running to the aircraft like you see in at dramatization or whatever, because when you hurry and you rush, you make mistakes, and when you get that heart rate elevated, you're just gonna actually take longer probably because you have to go back and do it again. So, but at the same time, like, hey, there is a sense of urgency. Like, hey, 5-10 minutes that could mean difference between life and death. So you got that kind of exciting aspect to it, and also hey, shutting down an interstate or coming in and landing in somebody's backyard with like 100-foot trees all around it, and it's like the dynamic atmosphere of that. Like, I don't even know what this place looks like until I get there. Like, so that's where I say we earn our paycheck, right? Those few times it's like, hey, we may be bored straight and level, but man, that last little bit of approach or takeoff, it's like, man, you're using all of your experience that you've gotten up to that point. And that's kind of why EMS is like, it's not a learning environment. You already need to know it by the time you get there. That's why the
Yeah.
requirements are so high.
I mean, especially nighttime,
Yeah.
going into an LZ unlit, not great moon loom. You got old Jim Bob down there from the volunteer fire department trying to tell you which way the winds are coming from. And, I think there's a power line there. And what about that power line, Jim Bob? Oh, yeah, well, there's that one too. So yeah, for me, I went into air medical. I obviously worked as a flight instructor. I did stuff out in Texas that you're familiar with, kind of when we started to cross paths. Flew tours at Maverick. I felt like I was fairly well rounded at that point. And then I remember for the first little bit of air medical, definitely feeling slightly behind, and always not like in a bad way, just kind of that normal, like, this is a new operation. Everything kind of feels not familiar, even though we did quite a bit of training. And of course, the first call that I ever got was a scene call in Edwards County, way outside of Del Rio, going to San Angelo, not going to San Antonio, where I had rehearsed and practiced helipad landings and things like that. Flying to this small trauma center in San Angelo where there's like a ground pad and it's between two buildings, and there's also like a walkway, like a elevated walkway between the two buildings. So like you're like having to navigate your way through this pretty tight landing. I remember kind of feeling overwhelmed. What was that feeling for you on your first air medical flight?
Yeah, you you definitely get to some of these helipads and you're like, well, they definitely didn't ask a helicopter pilot what they thought of setting this thing up, right? It's just the amount of obstacles and stuff. And, kind of thinking about the night flight. I remember my first night scene call, and I got out there and, of course it's like, hey, I'd done some scene calls during the day that weren't, a huge deal, but also where I'm at in Arkansas, I mean, there's everywhere's 100-foot trees. I mean, it's like, we're talking about serious obstacles to come out of, right? Anyways, this is the first nighttime one. We go far out there. It's like a 15-20 minute flight already. And then I'm getting there. They still haven't even gotten the guy out. He like drove off some ravine or something like that. And I'm circling this scene on the highway. And by the third loop around, I saw power lines that were right next to the road that I was going to land on. So it was just like, holy cow, man. Like I didn't see those until the third lap around. So it's like, hey, especially on the night scenes, like don't be in a rush to get in there, because I mean, you may not see something. I mean, we do have night vision goggles, which is a godsend, and I can't imagine flying at night without them now. At this point, I'm spoiled. And on some of these like kind of hazy nights, I'll like glance under my goggles and then look, and I can't see anything. And just I'm thinking about like my lead pilot who's been doing this for 20 years. Like they used to fly without those, and I'm like, dude, that's just messed up, man. Yeah.
I
But
know the ones that came before us, I always thought about that, Ian, like, you know, 20, 25 years ago, maybe having a Garmin 430 or something like that, as your form of GPS, all steam gauges, no NVGs, and not really a culture that was conducive to safety.
yeah,
Nowadays there's such a culture around air medical, the air medical industry, of just being safe, not questioning pilots, not accepting when they turned it down, not pushing it, things like that. I mean, the guys that paved the way for us, the hats off to those guys, because it might as well just be a completely different operation 20 years ago.
oh yeah, you think about like the safety concerns that we have nowadays. I mean, God, it was just the Wild West, before all that stuff. And I say things like, oh, they didn't even have autopilot, and people may think that I'm being like, oh, he doesn't fly with that, but it's having a hand fly and punch in. Like a lot of these scenes, they'll be like, hey, I've got new coordinates for you, type in these GPS coordinates, like hand flying an aircraft at 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, and then trying to spin the wheel on a Garmin 430 to get that thing in there. That's just, I mean, talk about just a recipe for disaster, it seems like. So and then with our electronic flight bags, I mean, we've got two iPads in there. When I get dispatched through Complete Flight, which is a software we use, I just punch one button and it pushes it into ForeFlight for a pre-made flight plan that they've already in the center. They've already created for me, right? So I've got like, I've already got the grid coordinates, and it tells me how long to fly and what direction. It's like, and the nice thing about that is it speeds up us getting out the door, right? Because we're not having to sit there and plan out this route as far as distances and like what we need for fuel and all that stuff. It's already done. And we can kind of pre-make our manifest for the day on what we think, that flight's going to be, and then just click a couple buttons and you're good to go. So,
Yeah, I mean, the technology that we have now is so helpful. I would complain sometimes our autopilot in San Antonio, I don't know if it was weird interference or whatever, but it would mess with our HTOS, and then our autopilot would kick off, and I would be like, what am I going to do? Gonna hand fly. It's like, it's just so spoiled. But there's obviously a need to progress, right? The difference between now and 20 years ago is there is a lot less aeromedical accidents that occur, and I think solely the two benefit or the two main reasons are the culture and the technology. And so, kudos to Air Methods and all the other air medical companies that are doing it right out there, that are equipping the helicopters. They're spending the money on equipping the helicopters, and they're not providing that mission pressure. I mean, I think those two things alone are fantastic. And yeah, I mean, sometimes some technology is too much. Sometimes it's just okay to hand fly or get your eyes outside. You can kind of get trapped inside sometimes, but by and large, our industry is safer because of the technology.
Absolutely. And, on the safety culture mindset, I feel like a lot of people that get themselves into trouble is it's an internal like self pressure that they're putting on themselves that a lot of times there isn't an external thing. I know at Air Methods, they're super great about that safety culture. And I mean, we're the biggest air medical operation in the United States. So obviously we have a lot of aircraft, a lot of pilots, a lot of exposure to potential issues, right? So, it's kind of like anything else. The more of them out there, the more likely something is to happen. But, even coworkers, I see them, talk about, hey, I had to divert, or, I had to land in a field. And it's like, how much are you really taking stock of the weather before you decide to launch that flight, right? Because, anybody that has a cowboy attitude or, like a, hey, we can do it, I'm not afraid kind of mindset, it's just the wrong attitude to have. And it feels a little bit heartless, but you kind of have to think of the people you're carrying as just, I'm just taking a box from A to B. That's it, right? So, I don't want to risk my life and the life of my nurse and my medic, to somebody else's emergency is not our emergency, right? We're going to help them as best we can, but at the same time, like, these are not people that are, this isn't like combat or anything like that. Like, people aren't getting shot at, and we're not going to be flying into bullets and all that stuff. But weather is a very serious factor, and I mean, it kills a lot of people. You have to take that into account and respect that.
Yeah, I mean, we always said that. Again, I'll piggyback on you. It's not your emergency. That was part of the culture where I worked, but it's still hard. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you want to go out and help someone, I personally was pretty good at disconnecting because I think I have a overwhelming sense of not wanting to die myself. And I figure if I don't kill myself in a helicopter, then my medic and nurse are going to be safe. So that's like it's kind of killing two birds with one stone. So I always was fairly conservative in my calls just because it, truly wasn't my emergency. It's funny, I'm doing the ski patrol now, training, I should say. Finish training this winter, hopefully, and pass. But they have kind of like the opposite mindset. They're like, go, go, go. You got to go now, go. And I'm thinking like, man, I feel like this is where, people make mistakes. So I'm kind of interested to see where that goes. And Jackie Sanders, a buddy of mine that was on the podcast just a couple weeks ago, he talks about that. He's a military guy, came over to the civilian world. And he did a lot of civilian flying prior to air medical, so he was already pretty well adapted to kind of the difference. And he thought, in his perspective, that a lot of the military guys are used to going out when no one else will. Because you're fighting a war, and you got American soldiers that need you to come pick them up, and there's gunfire, and there's bad weather, or there's this or whatever it is. And so like that mentality of like, hey, you're going and you might die is perfectly acceptable and expected in the military, but obviously much of a culture shift. So, I wonder if it's a little bit harder for some of those guys with combat experience, when they transition to air medical, because I could see that, that transfer of what they used to do in the military be kind of a negative effect. So, it all takes, there's just so much that goes into it, and so much of being safe in a helicopter is very personal, right? It's about the guy up front.
Absolutely. And a lot of, there are built-in things too that help us kind of disconnect with that. Like, for example, when they dispatch me out, they're not going to tell me details about the patient or how badly they're hurt or what's going on, right? They're just going to say, hey, this is where you're going for this many nautical miles, and the patient weight, if they have it, right, is such and such. I mean, obviously, if they say patient weight, 20 pounds, it's a child, right? But most of the kid stuff we get is we're picking up from the hospital. They're already stable, right? and then they're going to Children's in Dallas or in Little Rock. So even things like that, like, hey, if especially on a transfer, like somebody's in a hospital and they're stable in the hospital, they're not bleeding on the side of the road, right? But that being said, yeah, I can see having trouble kind of making that disconnect. And the thing I tried to do early on is, everybody knows the saying, it's one to three to go, one to say no, right? And the thing, so that means that, hey, anybody that's in the aircraft can say, I don't feel comfortable with this, right? I kind of set up that safe mindset as far as the calls I would make. So where, a lot of my med crew, they don't really question if I say, hey, we're good, then they're riding with me. And that's a weight that I take seriously because, like, hey, they trusted me. So I'm going to make sure that I make good decisions. And like, I don't want to put them in danger. Right. And I don't want them to lose face in that. Right. Cause I've got nothing to prove to anybody at this point, right? If we can go, we're gonna go, right? If we can't go and we can't make a safe call, we're not gonna go, right? And I'm gonna check back in an hour and see if the weather's good, and then we'll go at that point. But it's just one of those things you got to be able to just make that disconnection and make that call.
Yeah, in regards to what we call the 51% rule, where everyone has 51% power. I don't know what your thoughts are. My opinion on that always, and maybe I'll catch some flack for this, but my thought was always like, if I'm having a crew member, nurse or medic, 51% me, then I did something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't brief properly. I was maybe setting up negative. Maybe they were thinking, some of my previous decisions were questionable or whatnot. So I personally feel like, man, if you have to get 51% it, then there's a disconnect somewhere. That's just my opinion. I don't know if you have a thought on
Yeah,
that.
no, I mean, and it one thing I've learned about this business is the people you work with, like the medical crew, can almost make it or break it for a base as far as your experience. I'm super lucky at Texarkana. All the folks I work with are top notch professionals. Some of the places I've heard in the grapevine, either talking to people or experience, you get those few people who they just don't want to work. It seems like, and that's another issue. But if hey, if you make a questionable decision and you have a repeat kind of past of making these questionable decisions, you might want to look inward and be like, hey, am I causing these people to be fearful of my judgment? You know what I mean? At the same time, like, hey, yes, they're in the helicopter, but we are the pilots, right? We spent all these years of experience encountering these things and learning about this stuff. I'm more than happy to explain and educate people. Like, I feel like these folks that are riding the helicopter, me taking the same risk as me, they don't know a lot of these factors as far as like, hey, just how the helicopter works, right? How an auto rotation works, things like this. We're flying around with one engine, right? Hey, what are some things that are going in my mind so you can know? They may not know flying with another pilot that likes to be at 300 feet, or 500 feet. And it's like, hey, you don't have any time if something happens, or doing double IMC procedures and really I like to get realistic as possible for that. So we're, double IMC, if we accidentally go in the clouds, we're required quarterly to train with the crew. So I always like to be, about 500 feet or so and kind of do that thing where I'm mimicking flying in deteriorating conditions, and I'm trying to act like a pilot that is not willing to make a decision, right? So what I'm trying to get the crew is to speak up and just not just be resigned to their fate and be like, hey, listen, man, I'm not comfortable with this. Let's, find something else. Let's either divert or land or something. And sometimes, like, I can tell you, having been in those situations with the pilot deteriorating weather, it's really hard to make that decision sometimes in the air. It's really easy. You and me sitting here talking about the ground. Oh yeah, I'd land, but dude, it's another thing. There's all kinds of levels of pressure in this business. Like, okay, when I say pressure, not really from management, it's just like on you. Like, hey, if I accept a flight, somebody's expecting me to be somewhere in a helicopter for a patient, right? And then now I pick that person up. Now I've got a patient on board, and they may be super critical, right? And it's like they're expecting to get to a hospital. So, man, having to make a call to land on a highway and have an ambulance meet you somewhere is, I mean, that's tough, right? But hey, you've got a support structure. You got two people in the back, and they can help you out. They can get on the horn and set that up, and you just worry about flying the aircraft, and you can get through something like that. I kind of remember I had I was going to Little Rock. I had a FADEC degrade, which it's not a super critical emergency, but the FADEC is controls our fuel to the engine, and any kind of problem with that is something to be concerned about. So what I didn't want to do is continue to the hospital and, for one, go into like a confined area landing, max performance type of thing or steep approach. And then now I'm shut down and I'm broke down on their hospital pad. And now I'm keeping people from coming in there. So we were able to coordinate with the ambulance service, and they met us like right at the nearby airport and took them from there, which I'm glad it worked out because the patient was actually like almost coding, as we were coming in. So it was a little bit critical of an issue. So, we made sure the maintenance team got on that and got that fixed, but it happens,
Yeah,
right?
it's definitely interesting. Like you said, it's usually status quo, right? Your milk run A to B, same flight all the time. It's when the weather changes, deteriorates quickly, the helicopter breaks. You have to kind of make that decision. I had times when winds were kind of unforecasted. I thought I could maybe make it to San Antonio. We were doing like a long, pick someone up way out in the sticks. Fuel is always a little close, and I always kind of margin on the safe side, like, maybe I can make it to San Antonio, but like it's gonna be real tight. So like, hey, dispatch, call ahead. I'm gonna hot fuel at this location. I don't want to run out of gas, right? So I think it's always kind of fun. It's stressful at the time, but always fun to kind of do because it really challenges you as a pilot, decision making, things like that. Um, with your FADEC degrade, was it your collective position lever angle? Your what is it? PLA. I've
No, we had a problem with the HMU. It was actually a problem we figured out with the manufacturer. They'd switched manufacturers of this part. We went through like 4 of these parts before we got to go. And I think 2 ECUs. I mean, it's just, as great and, as the technology is in these modern aircraft, it's just more electronics and in my opinion, more stuff to break, right? So something to be said about some of these simpler, older machines that like, hey, they just work. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, the FADEC's nice,
yes.
but yeah, it's just one more thing to fail, and typically it's an expensive fail. Hopefully it's not a fail to a point where you're full manual mode. But again, at least with the everything up to the GXI, you at least have a revisionary mode. It always kind of spooked me out saying like the 130, and I think with the GXI now, I don't have GXI time, so I don't know if you're flying the GX, you can school me on it, but or the GXI, I should say. But with the 130, you get a full FADEC failure. I would ask my instructor at Maverick at the time, like, well, what happens to the helicopter? Like, well, we don't really know. It's like, what do you mean? Like, like because the throttle is just an on and off switch. I have no revisionary mode, no way to actually manually manipulate that throttle. So it always kind of spooked me. So at least with most of the 407s, even if you have the full FADEC failure, it's kind of just like, say, flying a Schweitzer or a Robinson that has a really bad correlator, and a broken governor.
Yeah, I
Uh,
fly a GX, so it's only got that single FADEX. They're all dual channel now in the GXIs, which is nice. And did you guys fly the B4s or the T2s for the 130?
both,
Both.
both. We were both, and both. The throttle was an on and off switch.
But so I actually just did this last week. I did the Airbus transition for 130 T2 for another operator that I fly for occasionally. So the nice thing about the 130 T2, I don't know much about the B4, but it's got dual channel FADEC for one, so the likelihood of FADEC failure is very low. And it's got an EBCOW, which is essentially
Yep.
just a simple metering governor that actually works pretty decent. I mean, as long as you're not just cranking on that collective, as you lower collective, it will reduce power and it stays in there pretty good. So even though you don't have that manual throttle control, like, you're still going to have that. It's really pretty impressive when you look at the inner workings of how they design these things. Like, man, I'll give it up to the French, man. They designed with Eurocopter, with the A-Star and the 130, they designed some really awesome aircraft. And, I kind of prefer them to Bell a little bit, just how they're set
Yeah,
up.
yeah. I mean, it's I like both, products, Airbus and Bell. The B4 also does have the EBCOW, so you're right. I mean, the theoretical rabbit hole of what if is pretty slim. Of having both channels go down, having an EBCOW issue. But I don't know. I'm still kind of partial to just also having my, manual manipulation, just kind of my I guess, personal preference. But yeah, I mean, I love the T2. Are you allowed to talk about what you're doing with the T2? That sounds pretty cool. I wasn't aware of that.
Just a private owner that I fly for occasionally. But yeah, I mean, if you're in a situation where both FADEX and the EBCAP fail, I mean, you're what's next? The main rotor falls off. I mean, like
Yeah, I mean,
it's
you're
a
right.
bad
Yeah, I mean,
day.
you're having a really, really bad day. Oh, that's cool though. I didn't know that you're doing kind of a side hustle.
Yeah. So, it's kind of a fun thing that I carried on, but from before when I was in Air Med. And, with the tough thing for me, so we work 7 on, 7 off, but since I travel, it's kind of like 9 on, 5 off is what it feels like. Cause I mean, like for example, my shift starts, today is Tuesday. My shift starts Thursday morning, but I've got to travel heading out. I got to fly out tomorrow morning to get there, so now, the nice thing about Air Methods is I'm getting paid for the travel and the rental car and the hotel. So, it does have that perk. I'm not having to eat that expense, which would be that would be a bummer, but, which, hey, if you can't get a local job, I highly recommend these pool pod positions. I feel like not a lot of people know they even exist. So it's like they pay you a lot more on your base rate just to be in a pool pod, and then they pay you overtime while you travel. So it's really not a bad gig if you still want to have a home in a certain area. And then, I mean, you could be anywhere in the country. They try to keep you close, right? I've only hop over to Dallas, so it's like a 40-minute flight and a 30-minute flight to Texarkana, but um, it's still, I mean, it's a whole day that eats up that it's kind of a little bit of a bummer. I would much rather have a base 10 minutes from the house, and be home every night. I feel like I sleep in a hotel more than the house, but yeah.
Yeah, I think doing like the pool pilot, the travel thing, I think there's a time in life, that
Hmm.
it's okay, or a time period. Do it for a couple years. I was not a pool pilot, but I lived in Vegas for the first year of flying air medical in Texas. And so kind of the same thing. I was 7 on, 7 off, but really 2 of those days were travel days. And that does get exhausting, over time. It's definitely nice to, have that closer base, but unfortunately a lot of air medical bases are not necessarily desirable areas. The friends of mine that live where they want to live and work air medical, it's because they grew up in some podunk little town that has an air medical base, and they're living on their inheritance ranch now, and loving life, but that's, most of us grow up either in a suburb or a city, in those, say, specialty jobs, for, that are in city hospitals. I mean, they're pretty competitive, at least at Air Evac. Any base that got real close to San Antonio, I mean, I remember I called my RDFO, Mark at the time. There was a base opening in Kerrville, Texas. And that was, I don't know, 45 minutes from my house or whatever. Beautiful area. Obviously, you're familiar with Kerrville. And I remember he's like, yeah, you're like number 17 in line and you have the lowest seniority. So I wouldn't count on that happening. So, it definitely takes time. Any prospects for you to kind of get closer to San Antonio, New Braunfels,
Well,
things like
you
that?
know how it is. It's all rumor mill until it's not in this business with especially big business like this. And yeah, kind of actually the reason I joined Air Methods is because they had a base in San Antonio, and 6 months into it, they ended up shutting it down. I guess they lost that contract. So that the only bummer too is that you could work for a while and get that base that's right by your house, and you got it good, and then hell, a year later that it could shut down. Because for whatever reason, right? I mean, we are a for-profit company, and if a certain base is not making money sense, then I mean, it's one thing if it's government funded, but it's like, hey, we can't just sit here and just lose money. It just doesn't make sense. But on the seniority thing, like you were saying, the big cities, like there's a long line of people that are waiting to get in there. So, and that was kind of my thought going internal, because we're kind of unique. We're the only union based program where the pilots are unionized. And so the way that works is all the union members get kind of first dib for 2 weeks on any position opening. So I kind of knew I had almost no chance coming from the outside to get that base position. So that's kind of why I went into the company. And usually the openings are in the places, like you said, not as desirable, where people don't want to live, and that's why they can't fill that position. So
It's interesting. I've never actually talked to anyone about unions. What has your experience been like? And what does that like look like? with a lot of our listeners out there may not even be familiar that there are unions within our industry. What is that? What do you interpret is the union? Uh, what is that like being part of that?
Well, I think I have a unique experience compared to most of my colleagues is that I was in another union back when I was in the film industry. Before this, I was in transportation, so we were a part of the Teamsters union, which is going back. I think it's one of the biggest unions around for truckers and stuff like that.
You were
Um,
in the mafia?
yeah, pretty much. So no, the San Antonio Teamsters are not quite as mafioso as like New York or something like that, or LA, but it kind of feels like that sometimes. But unions are great. I'll say if you're at the top of the union, but a lot of times for if you have low seniority, one thing I noticed in that industry, the movie business, is that, man, you just kind of like you have like different tiers of union level, and the top guys are able to do whatever they want, and then anybody coming in, you're kind of at the mercy. I don't know. I understand the purpose of unions. When you're dealing with large corporations, that and you get any union guy to talk, and he'll make it seem like it's big bad evil company, but um, I, f- I don't know. I'm torn about it. I'm not going to talk bad about my union, but at the same time, I feel like a lot of stuff. There's a lot of red tape when it comes to dealing with that. And anytime they're negotiating things, you have to have all these scheduled times, and everything has to be mediated. And it's just like it's very bureaucratic. I feel like so. Personally, I mean, I like to see when companies, if they're trying to hire employees, set a competitive salary, and you'll get those positions filled, right? The union can be a good thing as far as like, hey, we could have high salaries negotiated in, and I think they have a 5-year contract typical. But it could be a bad thing. I mean, I timed it out perfectly because our 5-year agreement ended the month that I came on to Air Methods. So but man, if it would have been like a year prior, I would have been on a salary from 4 years ago. So this is a crazy time here. I mean, and everything money related, as far as what it costs to live and what it costs to do anything, right? So we've kind of like had to change our mindset of what good pay is, right? Because 5 years ago, $100,000 a year was just like, oh man, that's you made it. Now I feel like if you're getting that, you're just barely kind of getting by, and it's tough. Um, so these companies are going to have to realize that, hey, if you do want to get quality people, you're going to have to pay for it. And we're seeing some wild stuff. I mean, a lot of these companies sign on bonuses $30,000 to $50,000 sign on, retention bonuses $30,000. I mean, really good salaries and overtime and all that stuff. And I mean, I love to see it, especially in the rotor side. I'm hoping it doesn't just kind of like ebb and flow and head back down the other way, but that's a possibility too.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some leverage just because of the shortage. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's going to continue. Companies, specifically aeromedical, that need a lot of pilots are going to have to continue to be just as competitive as their competitors, so to speak. And I like it. I'm glad to see the industry. I was a little soured to helicopters for a bit, specifically on the money situation. I don't really consider myself like a greedy person. I've always kind of lived by the motto of like, hogs get fat, pigs get slaughtered type of deal. Like, you don't need to get everything. But when I was flying air medical, this is going on, I guess, 5 years ago or whatnot, with training and overtime and everything kind of put into it, I was getting paid under $100,000. And you're flying at night, single engine helicopter. It kind of just rubbed me the wrong way of like, man, the guy's doing deadliest catch. Granted, obviously, crabbing in the Bering Sea is a different ballgame, but it's a dangerous job, and helicopters are a dangerous job. I feel like why are we not getting some level of hazard pay? So I am glad to see that the industry, specifically air medical, is having, I don't think they have a choice. I'm not sure they would do it on their own, but, finally kind of forced hand to, pay more. And you're exactly right. I mean, inflation's crazy. Went to Five Guys the other day. It was like $35 for two burgers and sharing one fry. Like I was astonished. Like, the world is changing. And so I'm glad to see that, air medical companies are stepping up to the plate and, compensating fairly.
Yeah, people, if anything, I feel like COVID kind of opened people's eyes of what their worth is. It's like, hey, it's like, hey, maybe it's not great to be slaving over a job that you necessarily don't like most of your hours of the day for pennies on the dollar just to scrape by, or even scrape by. And especially in the air medical side, anytime you're dealing with insurance, the amount that some of these transfers bill, I mean, like, the companies they can afford to pay us, because this is, not only does this have a crazy high level of entry, like as far as experience required, that you have to spend years. Oftentimes, I hear some people talk about making 25 grand a year as an instructor, 30 grand. It's like, I don't even know how you live under a bridge, I guess, or sleep in the aircraft or in the hangar, to, get it caught. But so, to go through years of that to finally make it, and then, now you're not getting enough to still get by. It's just like, something's got to change.
What's the point?
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I
yeah.
mean, I was the assistant chief instructor for a very large flight school. My salary was $28,000. Uh, I would work, 8 to 5 every day, Monday through Friday, I should say. And then on the weekends, starting Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I was delivering pizza just to pay my bills, specifically my student loan. So, and again, I stopped doing that in 2013 or whatever. So it's been 10 years, but it's just a crazy thing. I feel like salaries, specifically on the flight instructor side, have always been historically low. And I would hope that they're starting to go up a little bit because, yeah, I mean, you can't live off 28K.
Yeah,
I couldn't at
I
least.
got a shout out to Veracity Aviation in Seguin, because that's where I worked for most of my career and early career, and did all my training. They really, even before COVID, they paid what I thought for flight instructor was a very fair salary. And then they had flight bonus. So if you're out there hustling, man, you're getting kind of a piece of the pie per flight hour you're getting. And I think he was paying something like 75% of our health insurance costs and everything. So I mean, talking to other flight instructor, I felt it was unprecedented, that you were able to not have to have like a secondary job, doing that. So, and man, the experiences that I got, getting to fly, over, outside of the country. I think I've flown in like 20 something different countries, through there, and doing just wild commercial stuff like the hog hunting, from the helicopter, doing deer capture in Mexico, you know, um, all these experiences that, are not typical of a flight instructor, but really helped, I feel like, well round my experience as far as like this job's concerned. Cause I feel like nothing that's thrown at me at work is something that I can't handle, aviation wise, cause I've done a lot of crazy stuff. So.
Yeah, no, shout out to Veracity. I'm obviously very familiar with them. I know Derek and his operation well. And you're absolutely right. I do know that they pay well and you get to do so many different things other than just flight instructing. And if you're interested in learning how to fly, check out Veracity. A couple, what, two or three locations right now? There's Seguin, obviously. There's Georgetown. Is there one more?
Yeah, they've got Pearland and Houston, and they, if it's still around, they had a partnership in Fort Worth, with one of the universities up there. So I think it was the only 141 university pair program. So for all the guys getting out of the military that have VA benefits, I mean, that's something where you can go there, get BAH, and like you can really maximize your benefits, because that was kind of one of our biggest clientels was, I mean, flight training is very expensive. So if you got Uncle Sam footing at least part of the bill, it helps out quite a bit.
Yeah, no, yeah, the VA is great. Well, Ian, time flies when you're talking to an old friend. I appreciate you coming on. To our listeners out there, thank you guys so much for listening and supporting the Helicopter Podcast. I get to watch the little graph on my platform grow every week with our downloads, which are essentially listens. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate the messages that you guys are sending me on Facebook and Instagram. Everyone's always pretty nice. Do get a little hate on some of the platforms, but that's what goes with it. Did you ever experience that, Ian, when you were doing your critical angle
Yeah,
stuff?
that's funny you mentioned that up. So the biggest kind of advice I can give to somebody is just don't engage. It's like, and don't take it personally. Like, people are just mad at the world, man. It's like,
I
hey,
know.
hey, just and yeah, there's good and bad stuff, and it's like no matter what you do, people are gonna hate on you for it. It is what it is. But just enjoy your life, and don't let it get to you.
Yeah, the podcast is pretty good. I don't get too much trolling. It's on this helicopter side of the house. I'll post a video and whatever. My videos aren't perfect, right? I'm not. I'm a helicopter pilot and a helicopter salesman. So my my video editing is still kind of getting there, and yeah, people are just brutal. So the only way I'll engage, or what I'll say, is if you are listening, just let's all love each other. We're all helicopter pilots. I'm posting stuff on helicopter specific forums. Let's just all be friends. Not a big deal.
It's funny,
We
man.
can all we can all be cool.
There's
It's not a
so
big
many
deal.
times I've typed out a big long reply and I'm like, man, I look just as petty as they do, so I'd end up deleting it. But it's kind of like a therapy thing. It's like you're getting it out without having to get it out, So
Yeah, it's all just kind of recent for me. I had some people saying some mean things on a post from yesterday. Again, just a listing video, nothing crazy. And yeah, you think in your head like, oh, I'm going to reply with this, and it's really going to suck it to them, And then it's like that's exactly what they want. And for all I know, I might just be engaging with a bot or something. I don't know, but it does seem like unfortunately some of the helicopter pages are somewhat toxic. So, I appreciate our listeners. I appreciate all the positive feedback. I'm also happy to take constructive criticism. If there's things about the show that you want to see me do better, then message me, and I'm happy to take that critique. Make sure that you are liking us on social media. Instagram, Facebook, the Helicopter Podcast, and our YouTube channel now is the Helicopter Podcast as well. And I'm going to put links to Ian's channel, Critical Angle, into our bio here for the podcast. So check out Ian. Ian, I want to see some more videos coming soon. I really enjoyed your stuff back in the day.
well, if it means anything, I think you're doing a great job, Halsey. Definitely keep it up. And yeah, I've got a lot of videos saved up, so I'm going to start putting them together and getting them out there for you guys. So
yeah, sorry, I had to vent for a second.
it's
I'm feeling sensitive today.
Yeah.
All right, Ian, thanks so much, and to our listeners, thanks for listening to another episode of the Helicopter Podcast. We'll catch you next week.